Bienvenue à la dernière session de ce colloque conjointement organisé par le Collège de France et le Musée du Louvre. Cette dernière session va être consacrée au deuxième millénaire de notre ère, à l'Ouzbékistan et plus généralement l'Asie centrale, au deuxième millénaire de notre ère. Et j'ai le plaisir d'accueillir tout d'abord Florian Schwarz, qui est le directeur de l'Institut für Iranistik de l'Académie des sciences de Vienne, qui est un spécialiste des cultures manuscrites, des contacts, mais aussi des paysages et de leur transcription littéraire dans les textes persans, qui vient de publier avec Rocco Rante toute une description extrêmement précise, extrêmement fine non seulement de la toponymie de l'oasis de Bukhara, mais de son organisation interne, dans un volume qui vient de paraître chez Brill et qui va donc nous parler aujourd'hui de la transformation de l'oasis de Bukhara au tournant des 16e et 17e siècles.
Merci. Thank you, Etienne. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this conference and being part of this wonderful experience that this exhibition and everything that's happening around it is. And thank you to all of you for bearing with me after your lunch break. So I will bring you to the, I think, farthest end chronologically of this conference, to the 16th and 17th century, which for some of you might be science fiction. I'll talk about the rewriting the Palimpsest, transformations of Bukhara in the 16th and 17th centuries. The transformation of the cityscape of Bukhara in the Neo-Chingisid period was profound, so much so that it has been called the rebirth of the city. The extent of urban planning and expansion of 16th and 17th century Bukhara is comparable to the contemporary development of Esfahan in Safavid, Iran. I know not everyone would agree with this, but that's one of the smaller points I want to make in this paper. Abdullah Khan, who ruled over Bukhara from 1556 to 98, moved the city walls more than half a kilometer to the west, adding over 2 square kilometers to the walled urban area. For the first time, the Samanid Mausoleum became included in the walled city. Along a new avenue, the Khiyaban, and around the properties of the Juibari family, a line of highly influential scholars and politicians and merchants, massive urban development plans were realized, including the now vanished royal palace of Bukhara, the Shisha Khana or mirror house. The post-Timurid transformation of Bukhara affected also the old Shahristan or innermost city of Bukhara. This transformation is well studied, mostly from the perspective of architectural history, focusing on individual buildings and architectural typology. Mavluda Abbasova Yusupova has recently done a great service to the field with her book, The Bukharan School of Architecture in the 15th to 17th Centuries, available in Russian and English, and covering almost the entire period, covering the entire period I'm talking about today. Mustafa Tubev's monumental dissertation and forthcoming book on 16th century Shibanid Abul Khairit religious architecture pays close attention to matters such as patronage and historical context. From a historical rather than primarily art and building historical view, we are indebted to Robert McChesney, whose seminal article, Economic and Social Aspects of Public Architecture of Bukhara in the 1560s and 70s, published 35 years ago, still provides a roadmap for the study of urban transformations of early modern Bukhara and in a wider Persianate perspective. And these works that I just quoted are the starting point for a brief overview of public building and urban development in 16th and 17th century Bukhara. Let's see if we can make this work. Not yet, but I'm sure it will. Why is it not? Maybe. Yeah, one. Do it old style. So a quick note on terminology. I refer to the entire period from 1500 to the 1740s as the Neo-Chingisid period. It's a term coined by McChesney. The ruling Chingisid dynasty of the 16th century will be referred to as Shibanid Abul Khairit. That of the 17th century will be called Janid janit for the sake of simplicity. These are only convenient terms and conventional terms anyways. Yeah, there you go. To highlight shifting trends in public building and urban development of Bukhara, I have divided my short overview into 4 periods of different lengths. The first is from circa 1512 to 1557, what I call the main appanage period, when the Neo-Chingisid Central Asian domains were divided in different areas under, at least in theory, one supreme Khan, but very powerful regional rulers of the Chingisid family. Then 1557 to around 1590, that's the period where we see the strongest impact of the ruler of Bukhara, Abdullah Khan, and the Chuibari family, who worked very closely together. 1590s to 1610s, the transition period from one Chingisid dynasty to the next, from the Abul Khairids to the Janids. And 1620s, or Togay Timurids, sorry, I left them there, that's the Janids, never mind. 1620s to 1683, the reigns of the Janid Khans, Imam Quli and Abdul Aziz. So I just show a few slides and a few just illustrative examples of what is happening there. In the center of the Shahristan, between 1514 and 1557, we see the restructurings of the Kalan Mosque, the large mosque here in this area, and the creation of the new Mir Arab Madrasa, the building of the Khoja Zainuddin Mosque, of which I will talk a little more at the end of my talk. Then there's a second area of focus that's on the Shah route and to the south along those major thoroughfares. And there's some building activity here, the Baland Mosque, and especially the realignment and renovation of the Western Wall in 1544, and the building of the Walideh Khan Madrasa down here, which is already outside the walls, and then not on this map, and I don't have time to talk about this today. Of course, the construction of the huge Khanaqah and other buildings at the tomb of Khoja Bahauddin Naqshband, 12 kilometers east of Bukhara, which in a way I would argue belongs to, as a part of this urban development, even if it's far outside the city. But as I said, I won't have time to address this in my talk. These are well known, of course, the Mir Arab, and you see here the lower part of the Minare Kalan, so really creating this place here in the center, less well known maybe because it's a bit hidden in what is now almost suburbs of Bukhara. The Baland Mosque, an early 16th century mosque, one of the most beautiful ones, and I've just shown this. I should say that a lot of the research that's gone in this paper actually dates back more than 10 years to a project I did with colleagues from Bamberg and Uzbekistan on the Khoja Zainuddin Mosque. And so to those, I owe this picture where we see how the wooden ceiling in the interior of this mosque is hung on chains. You rarely see this, so just wanted to share this picture with you to show the intricacy and like ingeniousness of this architecture. In the second phase, so 1557 to 1590s, that's a period that is dominated by Abdullah Khan's efforts. Became Khan in 1583, but he was really the powerful person since the late 1550s in Bukhara. His efforts to abolish this appanage system, this system of regional power. And in this period, one can identify two focal areas of urban development. One is the Khiyaban, which is this entire area here, which within about 10 years, and we should include to that the construction of Char Bakr, of a major complex, architectural complex 4 kilometers west of Bukhara. This area was developed, large gardens, but also a few religious and residential buildings were built in Juibar, which was the village where the influential Juibari family lived. At around 1570, we don't know the precise date, the wall was extended, and this entire area here was included in the walled city. And the second part is the Chaire development, as McChesney called it, from the 1560s to 80s, development of the central commercial area from the Gaukushan Madrasa and Mosque in the south, on the river Shahrud in the city, to the Zargaran or Goldsmith's Dome in the center of the Shahristan, and already reaching out to what then later becomes the Labbe House Ensemble with the Kulbaba Kukaldash Madrasa. Again, a few impressions. This is a drawing actually from the Office for the Preservation of Cultural Monuments, and from Chaire Bakr, outside the city. The Gaukushan Madrasa here, which is the southern end of this Chaire development, because from the center of the Shahristan, the very center of the Shahristan, all the way down to the city river, the Rue de Shahr or Shahrud, and includes also the nucleus for the Labbe House development. So this all happens between around 1560 and 1590. Then follows the transition period from the Abul Khairids to the Togay Timurids. Here the picture changes a little bit, while before that we have these huge clusters. Now we have like similar patterns that are recognizable. Many individual building activities, mostly related to patrons who were affiliated with Sufi brotherhoods or with government positions. Very little royal patronage. A few examples here again include the Faizabad Khanaqah just outside the walls, and I think, yeah, that was just one example of this building activity. And then finally, the fourth phase, more focused activities that involve royal patronage in the reigns of Imam Quli Khan and Abdulaziz Khan. The Labbe House complex that became so iconic was completed around 1620, and then a little later in the 1650s, especially the development of the areas in the Shahristan, the Abdulaziz Khan Madrasa, new madrasa, to complement the old Ulugh Beg Madrasa and the Maulana Sharif Mosque, which would have been there. And then there's a few other smaller clusters, but nothing like the huge developments under Abdullah Khan. So, characteristics, to summarize these, one characteristic for the first phase, the 1510s to 1550s, is the restoration of older urban structures. This concerns two of the most significant elements in the religious cityscape since the pre-Mongol period, namely the great congregational mosque, or Masjid-e-Kalan, and the Magage Atari mosque. We'll return to that a little later. Well, this is, I think I have to go here, yeah. Royal patronage plays an important role, but a number of members from non-Chingisid elite groups actively participate in these activities. In the second period, under Abdullah Khan, the documented building and reconstruction activities tend to form coherent, large clusters, which, in the words of Robert McChesney, appear, I quote, to have followed certain planning principles. So really a conscious expansion of the city. Unquote. The two main development projects are the result of a close cooperation of a royal patron, Abdullah Khan, and the Juibaris, a local Bukharan family of rich merchants who wielded immense influence due to their wealth, network, political acumen, and religious credentials. In contrast, just show this a nicer picture. So, In contrast with the preceding 80 years, very little royal patronage of major buildings can be observed. In the transition periods from the Abulkhairids to the Janids around 1600, with one possible exception about which I will talk a little bit more. And this concerns a royal palatial precinct. Bukhara's religious and military political elites continued to sponsor buildings, mostly in more peripheral areas and without a clear pattern. And under the Janid Khans, Imam Quli Khan Abdulaziz, royal initiative and patronage increases again, along with the continued initiative of the highest non-Chinggizid echelons in Bukhara. The focus in that period in the 17th century appears not to have been so much on new developments as under Abdullah Khan, but rather on complementing or completing them. And this, however, resulted in some of the most iconic and impactful urban complexes in Bukhara. The Ulugh Beg Madrasa becomes the Ulugh Beg Abdulaziz Khan double madrasa at the upper end, and then the center of the Shahristan. And on the other end of this inner urban, also commercial circuit, we have the Labbe House ensemble with the Nadir Divan Begi Khanaqah and Madrasa. Taken together, they formed a new bookend, so to speak, for the 16th century Charsu development project. In addition, the middle decades of the 17th century saw the filling in of the few remaining urban voids. There was little space left where one could build new things without destroying property. And the Registan below the citadel, not everyone is aware that Bukhara also has a Registan. It's not as iconic as the one in Samarkand, but that was still kind of available place. And so there was a lot of development there. Most of that was destroyed in the early 20th century, so it's again become an empty place. So I will look at one of the two development projects with a little more detail, namely the Khiyaban. So this is the development here on the western side of Bukhara. What McChesney defined as consisting of four main components, which he discusses in the following order: Chahar Bakr, so the new religious ensemble and pilgrimage destination at the outside of Bukhara, that was very closely connected with the Tuibari family. Then the second is, so he moves from the McChesney moves practically from the outside to the center. So Char Bakr more or less here. Then the Tuibar district, mainly sponsored the construction there by the Tuibari family, who had their properties there. It included also two extensive gardens. In the literature, usually one reads about three, but it seems the third one was far outside the city. So two of them, but even those two together covered, according to our sources, here an area that was about half the size of the inner city. So really huge gardens in this area, and included in the walls, which is the third element of this project. And then finally on the city end of it, the Khiyaban, which is actually the name for this neighborhood here, and with the construction of a madrasa and a hammam and other buildings. All right. So one important component of the Khiyaban area is missing in this account, namely the royal palatial precinct. There are several reasons for that. One is that no trace of it has survived. And much less is known about it than about the four building and development project that I just summarized. Probably was also not built under Abdullah Khan. but a little later in the early 17th century. What we know about it from written sources. We hear first about gardens, a royal garden, the Chahar Bagh Khani, more or less in this area where I indicated this rectangle. The location is not specified in the sources, but we know that, for example, Abdullah Khan in 1557 celebrated, when he took control of Bukhara, he celebrated over several days a big feast, and that he did there. There's no mention of palatial buildings, only that tents were set up and carpets were laid out for the celebrations. It is the source, Hafiz Tanish, says that these royal gardens had been created under Ubaidullah Khan, actually by a developer who came from Herat, fleeing from the Safavids. And he was such an commissioned and committed builder. It was said in the source that no one put a brick on the ground without the exception of that person. So he was commissioned by the Khan Ubaidullah apparently to build this royal garden. So there is a mention of a royal garden there. That's where it starts. And at some point, this apparently was transformed into something more substantial with building, a palatial area with buildings. I don't know when exactly, and this we hear again around 1600 under the early Janids that he celebrated, that Baqi Muhammad Khan celebrated his son's circumcision with a big ceremony in the Guzar Khiyaban, so in the Khiyaban neighborhood. But that's all we hear about. It's again a place where there's enough space to celebrate. It could just be the garden. We know that Baqi Muhammad Khan was a dedicated architectural patron, but none of his buildings seem to survive. He might have started thinking about building something there, but we do not really know. We know, however, that by the time of Imam Quli Khan, so in between 1612 and 1642, there was more. Sources mention now a complex of buildings that can be described as a royal palatial precinct. It was known as the Shisha Khana, the mirror house. It was located in the Khiyaban neighborhood. So it was located somewhere here. The sources write that the Shisha Khana included a mosque and a Khanaqah, that it was the residence, the manzil for the ruler in Bukhara. And when, for example, Imam Quli Khan began losing his eyesight, famously, he assembled Sufis from all around his dominions there, hoping for the healing intervention. And at other occasions, he invited Sufi peers to hold their retreats there. Actually, this neighborhood was still known in the 20th century as the Shisha Khana this year, but no memory of the palace survived. There was local tradition has that there used to be artisans there who made mirrors, but that's a folk etymology or explanation. So when and where did the Shibani, Abul Khairids and Janids create a palatial precinct in Bukhara? This question is not as trivial as it or trifling as it might sound. It actually matters beyond an interest in reconstructing the urban history of Bukhara. If, as I posit, suburban royal gardens commissioned by Ubaidullah Khan in the early 16th century were transformed into an architecturally complex residence and court public interface in the first years, the first third of the 17th century, then this considerably expands our perspective on palatial architecture in early modern Muslim societies and about the role of palatial architecture as an interface between court life and public life. In particular, it would challenge notions of Safavid exceptionalism and set the development of Esfahan, the famous development of Esfahan under Shah Abbas and his successors, in a much wider context. There are obvious differences, and Esfahan might be a much larger development. but the underlying principles of planning, function, and urban context of the royal precincts of Esfahan, Balkh, and Bukhara appear to be much more similar and open to comparison among them than with palatial architecture, say in the Ottoman Empire, or Mughal South Asia, which has usually been used as a point of reference for Esfahan and of a point of contrast. I should pick up the passing reference I've just made to Balkh. Only scattered literary traces may remain of the royal palace, the Shisha Khana in Bukhara, but it is paralleled by the better documented Janid Palace or Daulat Khana in Balkh. This has been painstakingly reconstructed by Robert McChesney on the basis of literary sources and early 20th century photographs. So in Balkh, still in the 1930s, one could see traces before the new roads were laid out, traces of the Janid Palace from about the same period here in this, also as a western extension of the city. As in Bukhara, it was the result of a transformation of royal gardens into a complex architectural ensemble. McChesney dates this transformation to around 1610, when we can also expect the royal palatial precinct in Bukhara to have taken shape. The comparison with Esfahan and Balkh opens another perspective on the Khiyaban development. It has been pointed to the social cultural aspect of patronage of public architecture and infrastructure, which created, in McChesney's apt interpretation, a quote, public place in which to experience some of the cultural life of the city. McChesney had primarily the interaction between rich landowners and developers, the True-Body sheikhs, and the rural population in mind. The development of a built suburban palatial area around 1600 suggests, however, that royal patronage in the Khiyaban development already in that period was not limited to their support for the True-Body ambitions. It seems to have had a distinct royal aspect from the outset. It developed into an interface, I posit, of royal performance and public life that may not have been so different from what Susan Babai describes as, I quote, the subtle articulation of accessibility and transparency, unquote, in the palatial architecture of Safavid Isfahan. So just, no, that's the, yeah, skip this. In the very last minutes of my talk, I want to come just briefly to one source that has been very little used. It's basically a Bukharan flaneur of the 17th century. As the building activities in Bukhara are duly noted in contemporary sources, usually in the context of praise for their patrons, which is not surprising. I would like to briefly introduce a different perspective, the city as seen by a 17th century Bukharan author. In the 1680s, a certain Zinda Ali, who came from a village outside Bukhara, wrote a large hagiographical compendium, the Samarat al-Mashayikh, or Fruits of the Sheikhs. And it provides detailed first-hand information on Sufis and their communities in the context of the urban and rural society of Bukhara in the 16th and 17th centuries. Personal observation and memories of the authors are complemented by tales of his father, friends, and acquaintances. My references here are to a manuscript in the collection of the Biruni Institute, which I had permission to examine about 10 years ago. And what makes the Samarat so unique is the keen interest of its author in the cityscape of Bukhara. He takes his readers and listeners on extended walks through his own city, and a vivid cityscape emerges before the eyes of the audience of the Samarat. So he talks about things like, mentions there's a place where Bahauddin Naqshband used to live in the city at some point, which now, he says, is a chickpea roaster's workshop. So this kind of detail we find So the urban fabric of 17th century Bukhara is omnipresent in the Samarkand. I counted references to 56, at least, different urban buildings and 43 buildings in the oasis and a few outside. It is not a systematic local history, not a guide to sacred places like other sources of that period, but it ties directly and indirectly the city of Bukhara and its building also into a wider narrative, into a sacred geography of the Islamic lands. Just two brief references before I end. One is to the Maqaq-e-Atari Mosque, which emerges from the narrative of this manuscript as the most revered sacred place in the city. It's called the second Kaaba. We have references to Khizr, the omnipresent servant of God, who kind of ties the Islamic community together, and who, according to Zinda Ali, he quotes a tradition that he was born in a mosque, in the Khizr Mosque, on the Haus-e-Lesak, the snail pool, no longer existent in the city center. And Khidr performed all his prayers in the Maqaq-e-Atari Mosque, except the Friday prayers, which he performed in the Masjid-e-Kalan, in the great mosque. The Maqaq-e-Atari Mosque and the Great Congregational Mosque are represented in Zinda Ali's narrative as public places, and in the sense that they were not connected with a specific community of Sufis, but played prominent roles in the public religious life in the city. But he takes us also to places that are closely connected with specific religious communities, and that's the last slide I show, such as the Khoja Zainuddin Mosque, which according to Zinda Ali was the base, the langar as he calls it, of a Naqshbandi sheikh, and he writes about the things that were going on in those places, and we hear little about that in other sources and cannot really see it in the architecture. Also, even here with graffiti, we have hints and evidence for this kind of public life in those places in that period, but he gives very vivid descriptions when, for example, he writes that he, in one winter day, he heard fellow students, he was still a young student, they talked admiringly about a Sufi who had just completed a spectacular sequence of 40-day retreats. So that would be 4.5 years sitting in a cell in this mosque. And he came out of that, and a huge crowd assembled to witness this event. And the crowd was so big that people there would not recognize even friends and acquaintances. Such stories attest to the role that buildings like the Khoja Zainuddin Mosque played in the interactions of religious communities in Bukhara with their peers, with the city, and with urban society in general. Zinda Ali's itineraries and descriptions offer a glimpse into the place and the role of public buildings in the social fabric of Bukhara. And I could give only a very few, very small samples of that. It unfolds before the backdrop of the transformations that this city was undergoing in the 16th and 17th century. And with this, I'll just leave it at that, and I thank you for your attention.